I'd like to welcome everybody to our last but not least session on tenants' rights, current efforts to improve housing conditions for tenants. Can people hear me?
You're good, Phil.
Okay, great. So kind of as a summary, this is a really good session because we've heard a lot of things today tangentially about tenants and tenants' rights and problems that tenants are having. Frank Ford started the day by talking about how while housing prices dipped down, particularly during COVID, rents didn't. And in fact, we've seen this phenomenon of LLCs and absentee owners coming into the market, often not making improvements and hiding behind that corporate structure. So it's even hard for municipalities to do anything about the conditions of the housing. We heard from Dennis Keating and then again from Sean Smith about the affordability gap, that there are over 270,000 units that are still needed in order to meet that rents have gone up by 24% in 2 years. I've seen numbers for Cuyahoga County where the average was 750 and it's now over 1,000. So we're seeing tenants who are put under a lot of pressure in terms of rising rents, tenants who are experiencing problems with conditions because landlords aren't necessarily making repairs and it's hard to get them. We saw the benefits of having emergency rental assistance for tenants who are behind in their rent during COVID. Most of those funds have now disappeared, although there's still some programs that are available. We saw references to one of the CHN programs that was in the comments. And this panel basically builds on the fact that there's been a lot of community discussion about the fact that we lost a number of years ago the Cleveland Tenants Organization. But in that time, we've seen a number of organizations step up to try to fill some of the gaps. And so today we want to really talk about what the current efforts are in place and what does the future look like? What are the possibilities that exist? And so to paint the the landscape, and so to speak, is we have Jennifer Kahns, who's with the United Way of Greater Cleveland, and she's the Director of Strategic Initiatives and Community Investment, and she is also President of the Winton Manor Tenant Organization. So she is a tenant herself and deal with these issues. We're going to follow. After that, we're going to look into what are some of the efforts that have come forward to fill some of those gaps. Legal Aid now runs a tenant assistance helpline as well as the Right to Counsel program. And Barbara Retzlaff, who's a supervising attorney at the Legal Aid Society of Cleveland, will be speaking about some of those efforts. Chris Nestrick, who's the director of the Northeast Ohio Coalition for the Homeless, also known as NEOC. His organization has hired tenant organizers and has been working with a number of tenants groups, helping them to stand up, take advantage of the Ohio Landlord Tenant Law to improve their conditions, but also been involved very much in some of the other tenant advocacy efforts around improving tenants' rights through efforts around pay to stay and source of income discrimination. Then we're going to hear from two tenant leaders, LaTanya Morgan and Ron James, from their perspective of things that they've been working on. And finally, we're going to hear about what the future may look like in terms of additional resources. And we're joined by Councilman Chris Harsh. He's the council member of Ward 13 in the city of Cleveland, and he is working on the efforts of city council to provide some additional funding to address some of these issues. So I'm going to turn it over first to Jennifer Kahns.
Thanks, Phil. Hi, folks. Thank you for sticking around for the day. I am with United Way of Greater Cleveland, and I'm specifically here representing 211. I'm going to share some data from our 211 folks, specifically on the housing needs that we're seeing in the rental landscape. And I'm excited to share it. We haven't talked about it a lot in public forums, and also on this particular panel, a lot of the key stakeholders that we need to create solutions to fix these issues are here today. So I might be a little more bland, but excited for the dialogue after this. So I'll share my screen. So if you're not familiar with 211, if you're not familiar with 211, we are a phone number. Anybody can call us 24 hours a day, 365 days a year to get information on health and human service resources in our community. United Way of Greater Cleveland operates 211 for Cuyahoga County. We have a database of over 18,000 programs, mostly government and nonprofit, just for our county alone. And we had over 110,000 callers in 2022. So who calls us? This is a map of folks, the rate of calls per zip. You can see that most callers are coming from the city of Cleveland, and the density really mirrors a lot of the disparities that we see on most maps about our community, and also mirrors our historical redlining maps. In terms of who reaches out to us by age, people can call us or chat with us online. Most folks call us, so our demographic does skew a little bit on the older side. Why do people call us? Most people call us in a crisis. So that resource database that I mentioned, we have information on crisis resources as well as things like education, job training, homeownership. But a lot of people call us when the cupboards are bare, when the rent is overdue, and when the lights are about to be turned off. So that you'll see that reflected in the data. When people call, they'll work with one of our navigators, one of our trained navigators, to identify, to understand, what's happening, what the situation is, see what resources might be available to meet that need, agree on what folks think is a good fit, and then create a plan to pursue those. So in 2023 so far, our top need has been housing. You can see that 28% of calls, 20% of expressed needs are about housing and shelter, followed by utilities and then food. So historically, housing, shelter, and food have kind of flip-flopped between 1 and 3. And it's really been since the pandemic that housing has been securely our #1 need that people call about. We also look at met and unmet needs. So you'll see that in the lower half of the chart. And met needs, it's a little bit of a misnomer. It means that the person who called and the 211 navigator were able to identify a resource that the person was likely eligible for and wanted to pursue. It doesn't necessarily mean that the person contacted that resource, got through, got the service, or had their need met. An unmet need means we couldn't even find something that seemed like it would be a good fit. We are rolling out some new tools in 2024 that's going to help us dig a little bit deeper and understand if people are actually able to access resources and what that looks like. So this is our housing data overall, housing needs overall by month over the past 5 years. You can see that 2023 numbers are well above what they've been in the past. 2020, that increase you see in June and July is that when emergency rental assistance dollars became available in our county. We're going to look at that in a slightly different way. So this is the same housing data, but we've broken it up into the categories of what people call about, and it's quarters instead of months. It's over time. So again, you see where that arrow is, the start of the pandemic, and then housing related needs start to go up and never really go back down to pre-pandemic levels. What the big categories of housing needs that people call us about, if we start at the bottom of the chart, it's shelter in orange, then rental assistance. A group we've kind of created which we've called moving related resources. So that's folks calling for rental listings, moving expenses, down payments, and vouchers. So that has also increased. And then landlord tenant issues, housing conditions issues, which could also be repair, like homeowner repair. And then we've separated out eviction prevention We really wanted to see how that changed post-pandemic. And we can break all these out. So just within rental assistance by itself, you see again that skyrocket of need and also availability in 2020. So we notice that people call us not just when a need increases, but need increases in conjunction with when a resource becomes available or when people anticipate that they'll get a resource or be able to find something. But really our rental assistance, our calls for rental assistance have not decreased and have stayed consistent in 2023, even with the end of federal emergency rental assistance dollars. Also dig into shelter a little bit. We were really surprised to see shelter needs go up in the second half of 2022 and stay kind of above the preceding years. And you can see how much higher shelter is in 2023 as opposed to previous years. Also note that one of the things that we thought might be happening was that people were calling and they would get a rental assistance. They would express a need for rental assistance and shelter. And so maybe even though these numbers were higher, maybe that just meant we were giving more overlapping referrals. And when we pulled the data apart, we found that that wasn't true, that these were really isolated callers and isolated needs. So just increased overall need. So we shared some of this data with local partners and said, what do you think? How does this resonate with what's happening with what you're seeing on the ground? And then we also asked our 211 navigators, what are you hearing on the phones? Like, what does this data mean to you? And so we spoke with 7 of our navigators who had the highest number of housing-related referrals in 2023. So we had these conversations, I think, over the summer. So folks were still kind of reeling from high inflation and rising costs. And they really reported 2 main things. One, a change in the rental landscape, which you've probably heard about already today, but I'll reiterate what we heard. And then kind of gaps in the safety net for folks that were having crises that they hadn't anticipated, but there wasn't a resource to help them. So in terms of the rental landscape, the 2 big things that we heard were rising rents, so rents that had increased significantly from one month to the next. So maybe a rent one month was $900, and it was increasing to $1,600 or $1,500. So a gap that folks just really couldn't come up with. We also heard a lot about rental property transfers, and this confluence of the property transfer, the tenant didn't have a lease with the old landlord, and now they were also experiencing a rent increase. So they didn't really have any options to push back, and they didn't see that coming. Also in the rental landscape, what we heard, I think less frequently, but still heard nonetheless, was increases in requirements for security deposits, not being able to find a landlord who would take a voucher. And then something really unexpected for us was the increased use of online portals by property management companies. And so tenants had to use that portal to communicate with with the property owners or the property manager and to pay their rent. And for some tenants that had technology barriers and language barriers, those portals were unusable. And we had some callers who had the money to pay their rent, but couldn't pay it because they couldn't navigate the portal. And the second thing that I mentioned was gaps in resources. So really our navigators reminded us that for folks that don't have minor children in their home, there are fewer resources overall. And then we heard about, I think surprisingly, folks that were losing hours at work, either because they had been reduced by their employer or because they had a health crisis, an unexpected health crisis that forced them to reduce their hours. We were surprised because this was also when we were still talking about like the inability to find workers, and to hear that employers were reducing hours was surprising, but happening nonetheless. That folks also couldn't find back rent, had a lot of back rent due, but with the end of ERA didn't have resources to fill that back rent, couldn't get into subsidized housing. We also heard a lot, and have always heard a lot about kind of folks in this waiting period where they know that they are losing their housing, but they only have a few weeks to find new housing, and they won't, any resource that they want to apply for is going to take longer than that 2 weeks for them to obtain. So they essentially wait to be homeless. But you also can't schedule with the shelter. You just wait until you are homeless. So a lot of folks in that window. And then finally, just the constraint of resources, that SNAP benefits were reduced to pre-pandemic amounts in March. Utility prices were increasing. Food costs were increasing. Even resources that people were used to applying for were a little constrained. And with rising rental costs, like, it was just too much for a lot of folks to bear to make ends meet. So that is what we've heard, and excited to hear from other folks today on kind of what they're seeing and what solutions we think are possible in our community. And with that, I'm going to turn it to Barb.
Thank you, Jennifer. And we did have one request for your slide deck that could be posted after the conference. I also did mention, I believe, that you do actually have a dashboard that's available and is updated on a very regular basis on the United Way website.
Yeah, some of that stuff isn't, the stuff in the beginning is available on the website, and I'll share the link. But yes, we can talk about the slides too. Thanks.
Okay, great. So now we want to talk about, in order to meet some of these needs that Jennifer talked about, one organization that has always represented tenants and has expanded some of those programs is Legal Aid, and Barbara Retzlaff is here to talk about those efforts.
Thanks, Phil, and thank you, Jennifer. I'm a supervising attorney with the RTC program with Legal Aid Society of Cleveland. And first, I'm really happy to be in a virtual room of partners who understand the importance of safe, affordable housing. It's not always a group that we get to talk to, and sometimes we find ourselves trying to convince others of how important those things are. I'd like to talk just a little bit about legal aid and RTC so you know where we are and what we do, and then evictions and then conditions, because I don't think you can really separate the two. And then at the very end, just talk for a minute about the kind of climate for these issues and what we're seeing with landlords here in Cleveland. If anybody has questions, they should feel free to interrupt in the middle. So the Housing Practice Group in Cleveland is made up of two teams. One is the NEO Northeast Ohio team that represents people everywhere but in Cleveland, primarily in Cuyahoga County. You know, East Cleveland, Cleveland Heights, Shaker Heights, Lakewood, all those places, Bedford, Parma, Garfield Heights, but also out of county too. Ashtabula is a place where we see a fair number of cases. And then the Cleveland team, which includes the Right to Counsel group, but also some attorneys who represent tenants who don't qualify under Right to Counsel, who may not have a child in their home, but still need some help with subsidized housing or denial of admissions or proposed voucher terminations. We are limited in resources, so we can't represent every tenant who doesn't qualify for Right to Counsel, but we do our best. And with Right to Counsel coming in 2020, the staff in the Housing Practice Group essentially quadrupled. We now have 35 attorneys or 35 staff members, 27 attorneys, 8 paralegals. And so, you know, with funding from the federal government, the city of Cleveland, the support of United Way, other partners, in 2023, we'll probably represent about 1,000 new Right to Counsel clients and their families and offer advice to about 100 others. And it's good that our resources have increased because the eviction filings in Cleveland have continued to increase. There was a time back in the 80s when Cleveland might have seen 1,000 evictions a year, but the numbers have dropped more recently in the 2000s. In 2020, 2021, it was about 4,400 evictions. In 2022, it went up to about 5,800. And now this year, the court's on pace to hear around 6,700 evictions this year. So it's jumped and it's keeping us busier. So that's the Legal Aid Housing Practice Group in RTC. I think it's helpful to talk about housing stability and conditions sort of in the same breath, because a tenant in an eviction case is not in a good position to force a landlord to address condition issues. They're concerned with being homeless and not with the condition of the property. And so as tenants attorneys, we need to get tenants beyond the eviction to be able to address the conditions issues. So what we've learned from the RTC experience in Cleveland and cases in other cities, we've learned a lot about the barriers that people with low incomes face in finding decent affordable housing. Most of the RTC clients are being evicted for non-payment, but increasingly evictions are being filed based on the termination of tenancy, which really limits the defenses a tenant can present. Most of the tenants in Cleveland do not have year-long leases. They have month-to-month, oral or written, but it's easier to evict them and it keeps tenants from enforcing some of their rights. Most of the tenants, when we interview the tenants, they tell us what their goal is, and most of them would rather move than fight to stay in the property. They're too far behind in rent. The relationship with their landlord has deteriorated so far. The condition of the property is bad. Even if they could pay up the money, they have no faith that the landlord can be made to make the repairs. So the money, the ability to locate housing, and the time to move are the biggest impediments for our clients. Clients with low incomes who are in court are really concerned with having a roof over their heads, not necessarily a solid roof or good conditions, and they'll even negotiate away repairs for the additional time to move. With respect to money, and this is something that Jennifer mentioned, but also Gina earlier, I think we underestimated the difficulty in returning to employment that people would have after COVID, because people with lower incomes tend to work in industries heavily impacted by the pandemic, like restaurants and food service, childcare, home health aides. Those industries have been slower to bounce back. And I think early on we thought a couple of months or 6 months of rent assistance was going to do all it needed to do to get people back on their feet. But I don't think it has. And even though some industries are still looking for workers, some of these industries haven't bounced back. We've heard about restaurants closing. A lot of those employed our clients with lower incomes. All the food service, childcare, left a lot of our clients with part-time work and occasional work like Uber and DoorDash and the ever-present Amazon, where it's harder to prove you have a consistent income. It's harder to calculate and plan on a budget with that, and it makes it harder for them to move and to prove to a landlord they can afford the rent. I'm also surprised at how much the lack of childcare providers really has impacted the client's ability to work. It didn't occur to me how big of an impediment that would be, probably because I'm not in that position. But for some of the lower income clients that we have, it's more expensive to get childcare. They can't make enough money to pay for the childcare to be able to work. Some of the providers of childcare, especially less expensive, sort of more informal providers like older neighbors, dropped out of the business. Others, the more formal businesses, have fewer openings and are more expensive. And so if we accept that income is an important part of ensuring that housing is affordable, we have to include childcare as a part of that income. It's not enough to have enough rent to put the roof over your head. You have to have enough money to put the roof over your head. You have to have enough income to pay for the childcare that will allow you to work. And I think we also may have underestimated just how long we need rent assistance. We're still affected by program limitations. Both the programs have phased out, but also the ones that exist require clients to demonstrate hardships. When you have a lower income, it's harder to do that. It's harder to get documentation like birth certificates to apply for those programs. And there are limitations on the number of times that tenants can get rent assistance. So many tenants used it multiple times that they now may not have access to it. Difficulty in finding new housing. Most clients want to move, but moving is expensive, and there is relatively little assistance to pay for application fees and credit checks. It would be great if there were a universal credit check or application that could be used. I have a client who called because she had to pay $200 for an application fee. She currently has a voucher, and so her rent is, she's on Social Security, her rent is, I don't know, $600 a month, but she can't afford the $200 application fee and then to have to pay that again when she applies to a new place. And as I'm telling her, she's got to hurry up and apply to lots of places. She can't afford to do that. Some of the difficulty also results from tenants who ended up with evictions on their records unfairly due to the pandemic. So The landlord files the eviction, the rent assistance comes through, the eviction is dismissed. Maybe that even happens twice, but now the tenant has 2 evictions on their record that will be retrievable from companies running those checks. Ron O'Leary mentioned this earlier. Some of the courts like Cleveland and a small number of the suburbs have rules permitting the sealing of records. Landlords are sort of working together to start to challenge those rules that will allow the court to seal electronic access to those records. And in Cleveland, it doesn't even completely eliminate access. It just says if you look online, you can't find those cases. Other courts have, through case law and a matter of practice, allowed sealing, but as Gina mentioned, the state law didn't pass, and so the pandemic caused so many tenants to end up with eviction records that they're really having to rely on the motions to seal that aren't available everywhere to try to reduce that number of evictions. Tenants in eviction status don't have time to find decent housing. We've talked about that. If the overall rental housing stock is poor, particularly the less expensive units, the tenants will just grab whatever they can. And some of the units, particularly subsidized housing, like the Housing Choice Voucher program, is still bouncing back from COVID. Inspections were delayed or contracted out. It's difficult getting records. Tenants are having trouble understanding the processing. So some of those agencies are still understandably not back up and running smoothly. So tenants are struggling to get vouchers and to get inspections done to be able to move into a new place. So with respect to conditions, I've been doing landlord-tenant related work in Cleveland for a really long time, like, I don't know, 30 some years. And the conditions have always been an issue. And so I think it's important to consider that it's not going to be 1 or 2 things that are going to fix this. It's going to have to be really a combination of strategies. Landlords really have little incentive in Cleveland to make repairs, I think. It's not realistic to think that the city will inspect and cite and monitor repair of every code violation. The landlords will complain that they don't have the money to make repairs. And so both the prosecutors in criminal cases and those of us who raise claim in the civil cases need to insist on sort of an aggressive review of their accounting, because I think too often it's accepted when a landlord says, I just don't have the money, I can't afford it. It's a business, and businesses have to comply with laws. And I think landlords who've chosen to be in the business need to be treated as though they're operating a business and held to those standards. So that courts need to allow us to do aggressive discovery. Prosecutors need to request from the court that information to find out exactly where the tenant's rent money is going. And if the landlord doesn't have those records, they need to start keeping them. Because I think too often we, as a magistrate, I would scold landlords for treating it as sort of a hobby and not a business. But I think we also sometimes let them do that by not insisting that they account for the money that they're taking in and the money they're paying out. Motions to prohibit re-rental, I think, are underused. Under 1923-15, whether or not a tenant is moving from the property, the court can order the inspection of the property and order the landlord to complete repairs. It's a lot to expect of a court, in addition to all the cases that it has filed, to expect it to process these motions and to follow up on them and to set status hearings, because they can be slow going, they can require multiple status hearings, and it's hard to push landlords who don't want to make repairs, and tenants will just move. And then courts end up dropping the motions because there's nobody there to prosecute them. I think rental registration, some people thought that was going to be, that was going to cause more inspections, but it's really in Cleveland just to identify the rental properties and to fund additional inspections, but it's not a requirement that the property be inspected for you to get the rental registration, and maybe that's something that we can look at down the road. And depositing rent with the court, under 5321 is theoretically a good idea, but it's really underused in Cleveland. There are usually fewer than 200 rent deposits with the court a year, and it's not really that effective. I've always been surprised by how many landlords can just lose access to one tenant's rent without it making a dent in their financials. It's a little disturbing because it tells you how much of that money is not going back into the property. But especially an owner of multiple units, if they have 50 units and a tenant is depositing, or 2 tenants are depositing, it probably isn't worth their time to go down and fight for that money. They can just leave it on deposit. And there's nothing that forces that issue unless the tenant files another complaint, and they're not likely to do that without an attorney. We do try to raise conditions issues in the evictions, but we're really only likely to get to the crucial issues like no heat or no water. In those cases, we'll ask the court not to proceed with the evictions until the heat or the water issues are addressed. And the court's been thankfully very responsive about that. But it's not a way to get to things like mice and mold and electrical issues because they take too much time to get to. Legal Aid has a program through the Volunteer Lawyers Project called LASH. It's fairly new, Lawyers Advocating for Safe Housing. Private volunteer attorneys are taking cases to raise affirmative cases for tenants to attempt to address conditions issues or to sue for damages. So that's available through our VLP project on our website. Affirmative individual cases also, receiverships under 376741, in which individuals, or more realistically, a city or a CDC files a complaint to have a property declared a nuisance. The landlord's given time to repair, and if not, a receiver can be appointed. Kermit Lind is here. Kermit was really the king of receivership cases when they first started being filed in the housing court, along with Detroit Shoreway. They can be successful, but they're a fairly heavy lift and couldn't be attempted without an attorney, in my opinion. And I think we need to talk about early intervention to start before an eviction gets filed, to give landlords and tenants a chance to work things out so that conditions could be addressed without the tenants' housing on the line. Last thing, real quick. I think we need to look at landlords. We're getting a lot of pushback in Cleveland from landlords. A lot of them are reasonable, a lot of the attorneys are, but increasingly we're seeing landlords and their attorneys pushing back really hard on tenants. The tenant portal issue, the tenant can be locked out, prevented from paying. They make agreements, but they can't comply with the agreement because they're locked out of the portal. Property ownership changes where a new owner takes over with no proof of ownership and demands rent. Refusing to accept rent assistance because huge filing fees and penalties aren't included in the rent assistance. And then in court, we're finding the landlords and their attorneys will not extend move-out dates. They're threatening the tenant attorneys with sanctions. They're opposing motions to seal. In Cleveland, they filed 8 complaints for writs of procedendo mandamus against the housing court judge in the Court of Appeals and 2 in the Ohio Supreme Court. In many cases, arguing that she's intentionally delaying the disposition of cases, but ignoring the fact of the thousands of cases that get disposed of promptly. For me, it looks to me like landlords are, and some of their attorneys, some of the landlords, not all of them certainly, and some of the attorneys are philosophically pushing back and saying we should just be able to fire out our complaint and have you evicted. It's sort of a disagreement with and a disregard for the authority of court and the rule of law, in my opinion, so that any affordable housing efforts are going to have to give incentives or otherwise get buy-in from property owners or landlords and their attorneys to succeed. How's that for ending on an optimistic note? Thank
you very much, Barbara. That's a very long, good list of some of the challenges that are faced. So, all right, we're going to turn it over to Chris Nestrick, who's the director of NEOC. Chris, you're muted.
No, I was just telling Ron I was going to move him out since I'm talking. He's up next on the camera. Good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to be present with all of you. I recognize you've all had a very long day. And and we've been hearing a lot just in this section around what are the conditions and stuff. And I think I'm the executive director of the Northeast Ohio Coalition for the Homeless, and I want to bring us back to this idea that, when we talk about tenants and we talk about conditions, like how the real question that the Northeast Ohio Coalition for the Homeless face with itself is like, what if housing and homelessness are so linked, and housing is the solution to homelessness? Like, what in our mission are we doing to help provide tenants access to safe, affordable housing? And so in 2020, we embarked on a new strategic plan and reached out to the community. Many people we did surveys and stuff, and what we heard loud and clear is that NEOC needs to begin to do tenant organizing in our community. At the time, and still today, there was no, the Cleveland Tenants Organization no longer existed for a variety of reasons. And so within our strategic plan, within our mission, we made housing justice and tenant organizing integral to our work to end homelessness in our community. And that work was really about mobilizing tenants and grassroots groups to share ideas, to build powers, to ignite public support, political will, and initiatives for tenants. That work, we say that work is built into kind of the idea of housing justice, and that housing justice is integral to everything we're talking about right now. But justice has to come from the grassroots, and it has to come from the people that are directly impacted. So really the question we were asked is like, where are the tenants in these conversations, right? When we're building policies in our community, when we're talking about what's needed, where is the collective voice of tenants that is speaking about what they need and what they want to see in our community? And so we kind of built a new department called the Housing Justice Organizing Crew, and it's and their work was to begin to work with tenants to organize associations and unions to begin to provide outreach, education, leadership development in Cleveland and in Cuyahoga County to preserve, stabilize, and improve their own housing. And I think we've seen that work be very successful in terms of our work organizing a union at the Euclid Beach Mobile Home and having a really powerful group of leaders that are coming together to fight to remain in their home. We sometimes that work looks like a one-off kind of going in and helping people make accommodations requests in a really important way in combination with the Fair Housing Center. Other times it means multiple meetings thinking about, what do these tenants want to do to begin to address condition issues in their building or trash pickup, and providing support in canvassing their building to talk to tenants about the upcoming meeting and, the importance of coming together and having a collective voice. And so, we took on that work, and we've been doing it here now for about 2 years. I think one of the things we really believe is that for a lot of these issues, organizing tenants, building out a really collective, powerful voice of tenants in our community to both put pressure on our city officials, our county officials, to really find policies and legislative that would protect tenants' rights. I know it's, the state of Ohio is a hard place to get not be preempted at, but that we really need to have tenants at the table when we're talking about any type of services that are needed and policies that should be implemented. I think one of the things that we really were successful in as part of this work was looking at a pay-to-stay ordinance locally and really building both an advocacy platform to be able to pass pay-to-stay both, at local municipalities and the city of Cleveland during COVID. And it was a unique opportunity to begin to do that work. And I think now's a moment where we need to be really investing in organizing and building tenant power in a way that we haven't done before, which I think would lead to we would see much more success in tackling condition issues, much more success in policies that would actually change the lives of tenants and renters in Cleveland. And that, I think NEOC moving forward is intending to build that collective voice of tenants, and like we do around our work ending homelessness and having the Homeless Congress, and around people with lived experience of homelessness, and how do we shape that work with tenants to be able to have that voice in our community. you know, I think one of the things we really realized is just how desperate tenants are looking for support to be able to know what to do. You know, do we go to the media now? You know, can we do a larger rent deposit action? And looking for guidance from on how to organize collective. And we get, and our only limitation is to the capacity that we have. You know, we have 2 housing justice organizers that are working with, you know, approximately 5 buildings right now throughout the city of Cleveland and Cuyahoga County. But we've seen the impact when residents show up at a city council meeting in Warrensville Heights to talk about the building conditions and what's happening, and making their elected officials address those concerns. I think, you know, I won't take Ron's fire, but clearly we know the amazing work that Ron James has done, you know, calling out absentee landlords, out-of-state landlords, and demanding that there be a response. And I think there's a lot of we see a lot of little wins, whether it's, you know, accommodations are being met in a building that serves people over 65, you know, whether it's how they, you know, when they pay rent, or how they have to pay rent, like making those accommodations, and helping tenants learn how to do that. So now that building itself has leaders in it that can show other tenants what needs to happen to make that happen. And then ultimately, you know, how are we dreaming in our community where tenants are organized enough, have enough power to make sure that legislations like a tenants bill of rights is possible in our community. And you know, fair chance housing is legislated and guaranteed for people coming out of incarceration, and that everyone, you know, has access to vouchers, are able to use those because source of income protections are implemented and enforced. And I think that work can only happen when tenants are leading it and are the leaders of the importance of that work. And so, you know, I think I don't need to go into all the issues. I think you've been well versed in that, thanks to 211 and legal aid. But I think for us, it's about how are we dreaming of and how are we building tenants that have a collective voice to really change some of these conditions, because I think that's what housing justice kind of demands of us. And so I think I'll leave it there. We have some really other great speakers. I don't want to take up the time of the next couple speakers. So.
So Chris, we're gonna move to Ron? We can move to Ron James now, or to?
No, I think it's
Latanya.
yeah.
Okay. So Chris talked about the tenant voice, and so we're have the opportunity now to hear from Latanya Morgan, who is a tenant leader, and she's going to talk about what got her involved, and the struggles that they've been through in working through the issues in where she lives.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for staying. My name is Latanya Morgan, and I'm the Tenant Council President at Winton Manor. I was asked to talk about my experience. Happened about 2 years ago when new ownership took over, and we got some sort of grant or whatever to renovate the building because it was deemed historic at that point. Management, admittedly so, said they went about it the wrong way. What they should have done was moved us out and started renovating. We have seniors, we have mentally disabled people here, and we have physically disabled people here. They renovated the community room and expected us to leave out of our apartment for 8 to 9 hours a day while they renovated our apartment. They told it was going to take a week for each. They did it floor by floor. They told us it was going to take a week. That was one of the first lies. It was horrible. They stole from us. They stole people's medications. They sat down at people's tables, ate their food. We already live in a food desert. We have a a grocery store, but people here can't afford that. Heinens. It was horrible. They stole people's electronics. They broke people's furniture. They didn't repair it or replace it. I had an issue with my water. For 4 months, I went without water in my apartment. I only had running water in my sink. The property manager at the time told me that I could take a pot from the sink in the bathroom and carry it to my kitchen to cook. First of all, that's nasty. Second of all, I'm a paraplegic and I'm in a wheelchair. How am I supposed to do that? We went back and forth. I refused to leave my apartment. I asked for reasonable accommodations because of my health issues. I can't go down to the community room. There's things I have to do concerning my health during the day. I was denied. The corporate property manager, director, threatened me with eviction, said that I was holding up construction. That's when I contacted Abby at Fair Housing. We got some forms filled out for reason. This is after 4 months, and they put me in a hotel. I just 3 weeks ago moved out of the hotel back into an apartment. This was last year, July of last year. I'm just now moving back into my apartment. We had a flood on Christmas Eve. The pipes burst. While I was in the hotel, my apartment was ruined and I lost everything. The property managers, the owners, they didn't want at first to compensate us for our losses or anything. I contacted the media, and that's when things started rolling. So now they're taking responsibility. They put people up in the hotels, whatnot, that were affected by the flood, and they went to renovating their apartments all over again. I was the last person left because I needed an ADA unit, so they had to completely renovate another apartment to make it ADA compliant, which took forever. So today, with the updates, most of them are completed. We still have a few minor hiccups, but there's still remnants of the flood that need to be fixed. The pipes aren't completely fixed yet. Every once in a while, like literally every other week, we get another pipe that bursts. They're trying to trying to fix the security issues that we have here. We've had people murdered here, drug overdoses, people beaten, raped that come from the outside. They try to keep everything hush hush, but you can't keep that from us. We're concerned about our safety. We just had an incident last night where I was threatened, had to call the police. Person that doesn't live here came in, and then she snuck in the back door because somebody let her in. It's minor things like that to you all, but it's major to someone that's disabled. The property managers are trying, but then again, they're not. They're doing the surface work to make it look like, it's improving, but underneath there's the backstory and the things that are going on that we have to deal with. And they don't live here, so they don't care. That's it.
Thank you very much for sharing the story. And, I think it's a great example of having to continue to fight for your rights and stand up, and knowing that there are organizations out there that are there to help. And so hopefully other tenants get inspired and know that they just, can try to stand up for their rights. So another tenant perspective, we'll hear from Ron James, whose building is in the Shaker Square neighborhood, and the fight they've had with the topic that we've heard a lot today, out of town landlords and their failure to make repairs. Ron?
Good afternoon, everybody. Your story sounds like my story. I think you must live on Shaker Square as well. Until a month ago, I lived at 12701 Shaker Boulevard, which is on the north side of Shaker, and the apartment is 2 buildings from Shaker Square. I want to start with a story about a tenant that lives in 12701 Shaker Boulevard now, and he was my neighbor, like I said, until a month ago, and we both lived on the 4th floor of the 7-story building. He moved into his apartment in the fall of 2020. When he moved into his apartment, he noticed that black sludge was coming down from his kitchen wall behind his kitchen cabinet. And he complained to management. The maintenance workers came, the maintenance workers saw, and the maintenance workers left. They said they didn't know what was causing this black sludge to come down his kitchen wall behind his kitchen cabinet. Eventually, the black sludge ended, and he just had water coming down his kitchen cabinet. Eventually, the kitchen cabinet began coming off the wall, and he had to take his food out of the kitchen cabinet and put it on his kitchen floor because the cabinet was hanging at about a 45-degree angle. This condition lasted for 3 years when the apartment owners finally decided that they would get him new kitchen cabinets, okay? So after delays, the kitchen cabinets finally came in, and the maintenance department put the cabinets up. They put new studs over the old rotten studs and nailed the cabinets to those. So you know what happened after that. The cabinets started coming off the walls again. So now, 3 years later, his cabinets are still coming off the wall, and he can't put any food in his cabinets. The Chetridge family, which owns 12701 Shaker Boulevard, they also own 12500 and 12600 Shaker Boulevard. And these 3 buildings have approximately 300 tenants living in them. And the buildings are about 7 and 8 stories tall. The Chetridge family, which lives in New York City, are not poor real estate owners. They own hundreds of millions of dollars worth of property around the country. At one time, they owned the Sears Tower in Chicago, Illinois. Despite that fact, the tenants in the buildings that they own have not had heat. Some of the tenants in my building, or the building that I used to live in, have not had heat in 3 years. As a matter of fact, a couple of weeks ago, they gave tenants space heaters because the heat wasn't working, and the fire department came out and gave a presentation on how to use these space heaters so they don't catch on fire. As a matter of fact, right before I left, one of the apartments in 12701, space heater caught fire, completely gutting an apartment, and caused approximately $30,000 worth of damages. The tenants not only suffer from a lack of water, lack of hot water, there are steam and water leaks in the building, in the walls and the ceilings. They have overflowing and non-working toilets, rotting garbage piled up, black mold. As a matter of fact, I had black mold in my bedroom closet of my apartment last year, and I had to leave for a month because of the stench from the black mold smelled so bad that I couldn't live in the apartment. I had to move into a motel for a week. Finally, they came in, they killed the black mold, they painted over it, and they have not yet paid me for that month of rent, month of hotel stay that I had in my apartment. They have roaches, rodents, and other pests in the apartment. They have non-working elevators, and we have a lot of senior citizens in our building. But, if an elevator, we had 2 elevators in our building. One elevator, the main elevator, hasn't worked since February of 2022. So there's only one elevator that was working. That was the freight elevator, and that breaks down. And we have tenants in our apartment that are senior citizens and disabled, and they're basically trapped in their buildings, in their apartment buildings, and can't get out if the elevators are not working. What would have happened had that apartment building on the 2nd floor that burned up had spread to the whole apartment building? People would have died because they can't get out. In response, the owners have only given us vague promises of future work. Tenant morale is at rock bottom, and worst of all, they've lost hope. And into this disaster came the Morelands Group. The Morelands Group is a group of concerned Shaker Square residents. They want to improve the living conditions in Shaker Square area. They want to improve safety in the area, and they want to improve economic development in the area. We tried to organize the tenants in several buildings around the Shaker Square area. We tried to get tenants to put their rent in escrow with housing court, and also to file lawsuits in housing court, so to compel the owners to make repairs that are needed. We personally contacted the owners to repair their buildings to no avail. We've also contacted local officials, elected officials in Cleveland. We've also contacted the building and housing department that has come out and conducted inspections and have written up these buildings for the multiple violations that have occurred. And we've also talked to local TV stations. Joe Pakinakis has come out to our buildings about 5 times to report on stories of the neglect of the owners. Because of the urging of the Morelands Group, the city of Cleveland has filed a civil nuisance suit against the Chetrix family in housing court because of the conditions of 12500, 12600, and 12701. And we're trying to get a receiver appointed to take over the management of the buildings to make needed repairs. The response of the Chetrix is to delay legal proceedings. They know they can't win on the merits, so they want to delay. They tried to move the case to federal district court, and they failed. Federal district court refused to take the case. They said it should be handled by housing court, who has a jurisdiction on the case. They filed an affidavit of prejudice to the Ohio Supreme Court, and the court denied it and sent it back to housing court. Now they fired their attorneys. This caused further delay. Because of their delaying tactics, the civil suit filed by the city in March has not yet been heard by housing court. Because our efforts have not been successful as we originally hoped, we therefore are asking your help. We've discovered that this is not just a Shaker Square problem or a city of Cleveland problem, but a countywide problem. We need to make this a crusade to increase the number of affordable, safe, and clean apartments for the poor working class, and senior citizens of our area. In order for our area to prosper and grow, we need to stop rich out-of-town landlords from draining money and people from our county. We need your help in the worst possible way. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ron, for sharing your story and the struggles that you've had as tenants. I think it should be pointed out that receivership is a unique tool to try to use, and obviously the landlords have tried everything they could to get around that, but eventually it will be interesting to see whether that is another important tool in the arsenal of what tenants can use. So that brings us to where we are going forward. Given the litany of problems that we heard, clearly there's a need to address these. There's a need for more resources and new efforts in the area of protecting tenants' rights. And so we're joined by Chris Harsh, Councilman of Ward 13, to talk about what City Council is thinking about and how they're thinking about responding to some of these issues. I'll turn it over to Councilman.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. I think I'm the last speaker of the day, and we go till 5 o'clock, so I've got about an hour. Is that right?
I think you get 2 hours, Chris. You know, you
We're
can
going
do
till 6. Cool.
Yeah, you
Yeah.
can do the Fidel Castro thing if you want, but actually
Put
we
another
are
pot of coffee on.
supposed to end at 4 today. So
4. Okay.
yeah.
Then I will be mercifully sweet and short and sweet here. So I think there's 2 big things I want people to be able to walk away with in terms of understanding City Hall's view on all of this, because it has, by the way, been a fantastic slate of speakers today. And thank you everyone for dedicating your Friday to this very important subject. So there are 2 things that are happening that I think are worth mentioning, and I will again be brief. One is the Residents First legislation. I know that Cleveland Building and Housing Director Sally Martin O'Toole is on the call, so I don't want to speak out of line, but I think what she's put together here is a great slate of reforms that are going to help us really start to grapple some of these problems that have been mentioned throughout the day. The biggest takeaway, though, that I think everybody should know is that if you are a local investor, if you are a mom and pop, almost nothing we're proposing is going to change your life at all. What we've really done is sort of hone in on that out of state, out of county, out of region property ownership problem that we all see growing in leaps and bounds, and we all see as a much more difficult body of people to work with because they aren't located locally. So really, I think the core piece that we're looking at is something that is loosely defined as the agent in charge. These out-of-state investors aren't just randomly throwing darts at maps and ending up on Cleveland to buy properties in. They're being shepherded here, and they're being brought into our community by local actors who are usually property managers of some type, whether that's a broker or somebody working for one, a real estate agent, or somebody that just runs property maintenance. But there's local people that have been sort of shepherding these folks in, and they've been hiding behind paperwork. And a lot of it is being able to hide behind LLCs. But the bulk of what we're looking at changing in terms of Cleveland's enforcement mechanism is by requiring agents in charge to be registered alongside owners on the rental registry, and then really, really beefing up our enforcement of that rental registry to the tune of like another 30 inspectors and code enforcement personnel to really start to hold that expectation to a higher standard of completion. And it's an open secret in Cleveland that we've struggled with the rental registry for decades. It's never achieved the levels of thoroughness that we think it should. So we're really sort of doubling down on that by also then removing the ability for agents in charge to sort of remain in the shadows. And I think that this has got the biggest potential for changing the trajectory of property ownership. And like Barbara Reitzloff said earlier, if you get into the business of property management, we expect you to function like a business. And that means filing the paperwork, and that means doing your registries, and that means meeting the lead safe certification. If you choose to get into property management as a business, then we're going to treat you like a business. And if you're a mom and pop and you've got your sister's house because she passed away and you cleaned it out, and nothing's going to change for you. This almost has no impact on those local folks that own the property here or there. There are other parts of this, but I'm going to wrap up here in a minute. The Residents First legislation and Director Martin O'Toole has been very thorough in taking this out there to all kinds of housing related groups to really sort of get information out there and get feedback. I think this is like our best chance to really do real code enforcement for the first time in a long time, and to do it objectively and fairly for all Cleveland residents. And of course, I think the big is going to be those of our neighbors who live in the units that are owned by the least responsive landlords. I think that's where we'll see the biggest improvement. The other thing is brought up about tenants' rights and tenants organizing. We also recognize at City Hall that there is a vacuum in terms of services for tenants. Roughly half the city, give or take, are rentals, are renters and tenants. I rented till I was 35 years old, and it's just a really common way for a lot of folks in our community to live. But there are difficulties when renters have problems with their landlords to reach out for the assistance they need. And while 211 and United Way do a fantastic job of giving a place for those that process to start, they don't always have the resources to resolve those problems. So we are looking at ways to put more to try to jumpstart the organizing effort for tenants. It is difficult to steer funds at City Hall, and especially into a project-based allocations. So we are still looking at that. And where there's a will, there's a way, and I believe that there's a will here to do this. So I expect that we'll be able to get that conversation up and moving in the right direction. And I don't know if I might have missed it earlier, but some of our partners are involved in this call and in this effort today. So we'll be reconvening to figure out how to push that forward. But all in all, I think that the big thing that 2024 holds for us is that we are going to double down on rental registrations and on inspections and on holding landlords to a higher standard of expectations by really digging into the changes that have happened over the course of the last couple of years in the rental market, with the internet basically is taking over property purchase. So I feel like that was a little bit of a ramble. I'll stop. I don't know if we were still going to try to do a question or two. It's up to you, but in the interest of time, I'll stop here.
So we are kind of up against the time for the conference, but and I don't see any questions in the chat. But what I would like to do is just give the opportunity, after people have heard, all of the discussion. If anybody else on the panel would like to make any closing comments, Chris, I know that the council has allocated, has talked about $1 million that could be put towards helping tenants in the types of situations that we've heard of. So I think it's very positive that that's going to move forward. I know that there have been some time constraints, but hopefully we see that money hitting the street pretty soon, because obviously, given the types of situations which we've heard about today, we really need that. Latanya has indicated that she has an additional comments. So go ahead, Latanya.
Hi, everyone. I just wanted to say that when things were going on here at Winton Manor, I reached out to several organizations that are on this panel, and we got no help at all. None. And it was very disheartening, because I do know that Winton Manor has a past bad reputation, but I am really trying to change the culture here. But even still, we're human beings and we deserve the help that everyone else does. Last month, we did receive a call from one of the organizations that wanted to come and help us. And I explained to them that because of the number of residents that were here, that there would need to be 2 meetings, and they refused. So you're not helping us. We have 270 families here. We can't have 1 meeting. We don't have the capacity to hold that many people. And everyone deserves to hear the information firsthand. So they opted not to come at all, as opposed to trying to work something out. Then they did call back and say, a month later that they could come. And that's not acceptable to me. I don't think it's fair to any of us for people to get the information and the rest of the people to get it a month later. How would you feel? When we had the flood, it was the coldest day of the year on Christmas Eve. We called United Way. I called United Way myself. And they took hours to show up. I understand. When they did show up, they had 5 emergency bags. 5 emergency bags. What is that going to do? It's not fair. You can't treat people like that. You can't. And I feel even what went on here today, like we're just left out. We're overlooked. Our councilman, I'm in Ward 5. I don't want to say anything disparaging about our councilman, but he has not been here to help us at all. At all. And it's disheartening. The Christmas, the holidays, I'm the one that cooks food out of my pocket. He came and did something for pictures and was supposed to be here for 2 hours and he left after an hour. People are hungry. I'm the one that cooks for the building out of pocket. I'm the one that decorates the lobbies. And right now, Christmas, I've decorated the whole lobby downstairs. I pay for this out of my own pocket. Our property manager, our building owners, they're not doing anything. They say they have no money. I'm just trying to bring some cheer. We've been through enough. And I'm angry. I'm asking for help from resources that are supposed to help us, and we get overlooked. And then by the time they do answer my call, oh, we have no more money, no resources. It's not fair.
I don't know if you're addressing the call or anyone in person, but it's an absolute fact and a problem in Cleveland that we have far greater demand than we have resources available for the people in need. That's been a problem that we've been struggling with for a very long time. I completely agree that there's not enough adequate response for the problems that we're having in our community, and we need to step up. And that's, I think, what people are trying to do. No one person does it. It takes a whole community of people to try to rally around these problems, and there will always be, a shortfall somewhere. Unfortunately, we live in that world.
Sir,
I'm
this
not
is
trying
a
to
senior
insert myself, because
building.
I don't think you were necessarily talking to me. I'm just trying to acknowledge what you're saying. And I think that at City Hall we understand that there's massive problems from coast to coast, if you will, from Collinwood to the airport, where we have people's needs that are being unmet, and we have to figure out how to do more with less and better for all. And I think that we are committed to that effort. I don't know, maybe I should just be quiet and stay out of it. But I hear you, Ms. Morgan. It's a massive problem. I think that we're all committed to working towards a solution.
This is a senior building, sir, and disabled. There are people here that have no family. They have no other resources. I had a tenant that was eating her cat food. That's sad.
Yeah.
No one's doing anything. I'm calling food banks. Please come deliver food or whatever. The tenants, they don't have the repairs haven't been done. And in the tenants, in the property manager's defense, we do have a new property manager, and but he inherited a lot of this, and he is doing the best he can, fulfilling them.
Is there
So,
somebody on the call that would like Miss Morgan's contact and they can reach out to her about some of these issues, like immediately?
see, now I feel like I'm being dismissed, but
No,
it's
I'm
okay.
asking if anybody can reach, they can reach out to you directly for assistance. There's a bunch of resources on this call right now.
That haven't helped us so far. But
Right.
you all
So
have a good evening. I appreciate the opportunity. Good night.
Well, I think those comments indicate the types of the depth of the problems, and I think as the councilman indicated, there aren't enough resources. I think that's well known and understood. I would hope that any agency that can provide some assistance in hearing that, that plea for help, that they'll be in contact with with the tenants council there. But I think the reason for this panel today was to expose these issues and the types of make it reality as to, we heard a lot of numbers earlier in the session. There's a lot of data and stuff, but I think it's important to hear directly from, the experience, the lived experience of tenants. And I think we heard that. And I think that it is a call to action, and it's a call to say that as a community, we need to do more and we need to do better, and that's a challenge. And unfortunately, there are, as I think, Barbara's, list of problems. There are many barriers and reasons why many of these conditions continue to exist. And as Chris Nestrick said, it's important that tenants have a voice and are at the table and can, and are there to talk about these types of issues. But I think as a community, it's going to be very important for us to make sure that there's a focus not only on, stabilizing neighborhoods and home ownership, but also on making sure that tenants also are seen as, contributors to our community and have the right to safe, decent, and sanitary housing. And that we all have to do a lot more to make sure that that housing is affordable, that it's lead safe, and that it's a decent place to live. And I think it's not just, one, it's like, it's not one organization or one person. It's all of us doing, I think we heard today the types of things that people are doing. And I think all those efforts should be applauded, but it's clear that, more needs to be done. So I'd like to thank the panel for sharing their perspectives, their information, their concerns, and their ideas, and for participating today. And I will turn it back over for closing remarks.
Is anybody going to do that? I mean, I could do it, but
Frank, it looks like since you're talking, why don't you close us out here?
Yeah.
Frank, before you go, I just want to say that, I think holding what LaTanya said to us is really important, and that, when we're doing this work and we're listening to the reality of tenants, what the conditions that they're living through, we also bump up against our own failures and see in real life, the reality of what tenants are experiencing and facing. And, it can be hard to sit in that space when we're trying to do so much for so many people, and that systems are just so slow to move and they don't move fast enough for people. But I just want to honor that and hold that as what we were just offered was for me is a gift, right? A gift to really to really understand the urgency and the importance of this work and listening to tenants.
Can I
You know,
say
the most important thing that I heard in the last hour, there were many things, but both Ron and LaTanya expressed something. This sense of morale being low, and you know, won't go so far as saying hopeless, but you could sense it, you could feel it. And I will offer this, that over the last 6 months, approximately 6 months, maybe a little bit more, I attended most of the Euclid Beach meetings that NEOC organized. And this is a group of people between 50 and 80 years old. Many of them have disabilities, have illnesses, and they were faced with losing their homes. And the despair was the number one thing that I felt and heard every meeting I went to. But towards the end, the most positive thing I saw was how NEOC gave people a voice to speak for themselves with confidence. And that turnaround was remarkable. And I'm not sure. I actually put a message in the chat prompting LaTanya to talk, because I thought that maybe NEOC had worked with Wind Manor, because certainly what you did with Euclid Beach was remarkable in giving those people confidence and a voice and developing their leadership. That was very impressive to me.
something too that, in these buildings on Shaker Boulevard, most of the people are not on public assistance. You're paying close to $1,000 a month for an apartment, and you don't know if you're going to have heat tomorrow, or water, or hot water, and it just affects you mentally. Every day, what's going to happen today, what's going to happen tomorrow, and you get a change in your personality. I found that I was more quick to anger, less patience. And since I moved, I've noticed a change in my personality back to the way I was before. And if you just live in this hopeless situation that, if your building catches on fire, how are you going to get out? It just drains you, and you just feel that there's no hope at all, that nobody's doing anything. And I know that's not true, but if your condition doesn't change from year to year, you don't see any progress.
Ron, thank you so much for all the heartfelt comments you made, and LaTanya and everybody on the panel. I thought that everything that Jen had to say, and Barbara, about the points that they all made, everybody made really good points. So I see that Chip is on the screen. Chip, are you going to say goodbye for everybody here? You're muted, Chip. While we're waiting for Chip, I will say that this is the 34th annual conference. Chip was the founder of these conferences, and Chip, you're on. Well, maybe you're not. Actually, you're not muted, but we can't hear you. If I could read lips, I'd be repeating what you're saying. But the odd thing is you're not muted. But I can't hear. Does anybody else hear Chip? People are shaking their head.
No, he's not being heard. So Frank, I think you should thank everybody for coming and close.
Yeah, thanks everybody. And this was a long conference. We got a lot accomplished. We covered a lot of ground, and we owe a lot to all the people who were willing to participate as panelists, the people that were willing to moderate. And then there's the wizards behind the curtain, like Greg Bonanno, who really managed to keep us on track. I see there's a question from Mark Wiseman about those who are hoping to get the CLE credit. Is there a number, or do we get back to them when it's approved? And Greg, can you address that?
Yeah, we'll be emailing all those who are participating under the assumption of CLE credit.
Okay. And Jen Cons, I saw that you had a question about looking forward, not a question, but a comment, looking forward to more tenant organizing. I think I second that 110%. So thanks, everyone, and we'll see you at some next event. Thank you.